So, if I can get your attention again, please. So today we are very happy and excited to have Dr. Stixrud with us, sharing his wisdom and expertise. He is a clinical neuropsychologist who has been in private practice since 1985. He is also a member of the adjunct faculty of the Children's National Medical Center and holds a faculty appointment as assistant clinical professor of psychiatry at the George Washington School of Medicine. Dr. Stixrud is a frequent lecturer and author of the book Plain Talk About Early Education and Development. He has also authored book chapters and articles on adolescent brain development, self-esteem, homework, among other topics. He has been quoted often in publications including the New York Times, Washington Post, Washingtonian, the Wall Street Journal, Business Week, Barron's, and Vogue. Dr. Stixrud is a highly sought-after speaker, and we are very pleased to have him here with us this morning. Today's talk is titled Wired 24/7, What Technology is Doing to Your Child's Brain and Development. And without further delay, I would like to welcome Dr. Stixrud.
Is this, can I use this? Is this on?
No.
Do I need a microphone?
No.
Okay. Well, it's nice to be here, and it's ironic that I talk quite a bit about technology. I'm a really low-tech guy, a very low-tech family. And when my kids were little, they watch they could watch like 45 minutes an hour of TV, either PBS or some video. Well, my wife and I meditated in the afternoon, and my daughter is probably 6. My son is 3. They went to a friend's house and they watched Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle cartoons. They came back and said to his sister, "George, there's more than one channel on the TV." I have to say that when I first started lecturing, I was usually younger than the youngest person in the room. I'm usually the oldest, and it's getting used to it. I just have my second grandchild, and talking with a friend who is a year older than me, and when she was 65, her 5-year-old granddaughter said, "Grandma, how old are you?" And she said, 65. And the kid said, "Starting from 1?" So in any case, now, I said an outline. Is Susan Miller here?
She's not here today, actually.
Oh, okay, I sent an outline yesterday, or Tuesday, Monday maybe. So I don't know if people have outlines.
So what we decided was that we would post it online, since
Okay.
it was 14 lovely pages, and there's great stuff in there. And since we're streaming this and we're going to post it, that's where it is.
Okay, that's cool.
Okay.
So let me just tell you that if you want to check this more detailed outline, I want to start out just by talking about some of the things that I think are relevant, that are directly related to this topic, that are really very relevant to this topic. And the first thing is this, that self-regulation, and can you hear me in the back? And executive functions predict academic success better than IQ and SAT scores, basically at all grade levels. And because that there's concerns about the use of technology and executive functioning and self-regulation. I want to make this clear. Secondly, just feeling safe in your own skin. Feeling safe in this world is also enormously predictive of academic success and success in this world. That sleep is good for everything. And as I go through this talk, you'll get a sense of why I'm making these points. Any of you played Tetris? So they've done studies where they have graduate students, some years ago, they'd have graduate students playing Tetris in the evening. And they look at their brainwave activity while they're playing. And then they go to sleep in the lab, and when they're dreaming, they'd see this similar brainwave activity. They wake them up and say, "What were you dreaming about?" Tetris. And the brain does. The brain seems to replay things that happen. It's just sleep during sleep. Sleep tends to be tremendously important for virtually everything. I mean, if you look at what sleep does for athletic performance, it's ridiculous. How much faster you can run, how much higher you can jump, how much more accurately you can shoot. And for academics, it's absurd because when you're sleeping, your brain is integrating stuff. You wake up in the morning and you make connections about things that you've learned that you didn't make while you were awake. So this is an important thing. I will also mention that movement and play are good for virtually everything. And that humans and many species, the young play, they engage in dramatic play and rough and tumble play. And kids don't play very much. And I remember giving a talk on early childhood at Flint Hill a few years ago, probably 10 years ago now, and talking about the importance of play. And the early childhood teachers said, well, we can have the kids dress up now, but they don't know what to do. We know that meditation and mindfulness are good for virtually everything. That having a quiet mind, being present-centered. See, there's just hundreds and hundreds of studies suggesting that these things are good for virtually everything. And I also want to make the point that the human brain evolved to be a social brain. It evolved to interact with people, and so much of the brain is devoted to things that are important for social interaction. And I will mention too, before I talk about technology directly, that there is, I mean, all of us, I think, are dealing with what people are calling a crisis in mental health in childhood, adolescence, young adulthood. One by the name of Jean Twenge at the University of Twenge, I think I should say, at the University of San Diego, had this brilliant idea. There's a personality test called the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, and it was developed in the 1930s. And they have the responses of people that people gave during the Great Depression, young people, young adults gave in the height of the Great Depression, in World War II, Cold War, and it turns out the contemporary kids, like in 2004, teenagers and young adults, college students, were 5 to 8 times more likely to report symptoms of anxiety disorder or depression than young people were at the height of the Great Depression, or the Cold War, or World War II. And so there's a lot of stress related. I mean, you can't. We live in obviously a very stressful area, and the level of anxiety in kids that I see it's very different than it was 30 years ago. So I just wanted to make these points, and I'll say one last thing, and then I'll talk about technology, which is this. I think that it's unlikely. Most of our most pressing problems are not because we can't access enough entertainment on our tablet fast enough. It's not because we can't analyze enough data. The most of the pressing problems that we have in this world are stress-related problems, in my opinion. And I think that that my angle on technology is that it's hard to argue that it's so incredibly powerful and so incredibly appealing and so incredibly important. And yet, as I'll talk about today, if we think that the way to solve our problems is to use technology more and more and more, it's not looking like that's a very good idea. So, what I want to tell you is a couple things about the brain. So, I just want to talk about 3 brain structures for just 1 minute. How many know the prefrontal cortex? Prefrontal cortex is right behind your forehead. It's the part of the brain, especially that does the executive functions. So anything that you can't do reflexively, anything that requires some thought, anything that requires you to stop and not do something just automatically. So it does the planning, it does the organizing, it pulls things in working memory. It's important for judgment, and so I want to mention the prefrontal cortex. How many know the amygdala? The amygdala is a primitive part of the brain right here, and I think about the amygdala when I talk about it with kids as a threat detector. It's sensitive to the emotional context of your experience, and is particularly alert to anything that could be potentially threatening. So anger, you show people, kids or adults, you show them photographs of people experiencing different emotions. And you can slip in an angry face for a few milliseconds where you don't consciously realize that you're seeing it, and your amygdala responds to it. Your amygdala is very sensitive to anything to fear. You said somebody who's fearful, you think, well, maybe I should be afraid too. You sense anger. The amygdala senses anger. It will start that fight or flight response. So and we know that if kids, by the time they're adolescents or adults, if they have anxiety problems or depression, that almost by definition, what shows up the most in their brain is a hyperactive amygdala, an amygdala that's just more overly sensitive and reactive. And now, has anybody heard of the default mode network? This is, a couple of years ago, I asked the other 15 neuropsychologists in my group, how many are reading about default mode? And not a single one was. So for some reason, it's been writing. People have been writing about it since about 2001. And what it is, functional MRI, the magnetic resonance imaging, looking at brain activity. And what they do is they look at what activates in the brain, and they compare it to what activates in the brain when you're just sitting there resting. You're lying in a scanner doing nothing, you're just thinking. And look, that's the resting state. But people, until early 2000, people didn't study the resting state. And what it turned out was when you're just sitting, thinking about nothing or thinking about yourself, that what activates is this very specific set of brain systems that interact. They call the default mode network. And it turns out that the default mode, that it'll only activate when you aren't doing a task, when you aren't thinking about something, when you're just kind of daydreaming, or when you're just absorbing your own thought. And it turns out that the activation of this default mode seems to be really important for young people, for creating a sense of identity. I mean, just the idea you have to be able to think about yourself, have time to think about yourself and about your life. I mean, it's also is impaired in all the things that we don't want, Alzheimer's disease and various things. But it seems to be really important. And the idea of having time to yourself, unplugged time to yourself, seems to be really important from a brain point of view.
So the indication that you have past and future, what do you?
Oh, thank you. So the idea is it is the default mode. What activates in part are the brain systems that get engaged when you think about your past, or the projecting to the future. And the idea is that when you think about it, if you're sitting waiting for an appointment and you don't have your phone, or you don't have something to read, and you're just sitting there thinking, you tend to think about yourself. Right? You think about your own life, and you think about that I got an argument I got with my husband, and you think about ways to resolve things. And this time to reflect on yourself seems to be really important for developing social competence, a sense of empathy. But it's the thinking. You tend to think about the past or the future, and you activate these brain systems that are involved in thinking about the past and future. Any other questions before I talk about technology? So the first thing I will say is this. Well, actually, I'll say one more thing. That I'm going to talk a little bit about today about the way brain. You do anything. I mean, you put together a puzzle, and it changes your brain. And the experience changes the way the brain gets organized, and particularly the cortex of the brain. And it's true that using technology affects the way the cortex gets organized. However, the deeper brain structures that are much more primitive and evolved over a much longer period of time are not very different from the way they were 10,000 years ago or 100,000 years ago. So the structures that regulate how much sleep you need, or that regulate that your stress response, or the structures that are related to developing that close attachment to that sense to a parent that creates that sense of safety. They aren't very different. They haven't changed much. And I think so. I'll just make that. And Yeah. Certainly, this question, are kids too wired? And it turns out that by the time the kids are 7 now, by the time they're 7, they've basically spent a full year consuming print, digital media. A full year by the time they're 7. So I mean, it is so ubiquitous. And most of, and especially as they get older, they teenagers, most of their social interactions now are involve technology. And so they spend most of their time with other people, looking at a keyboard or looking at their phones. Kids spend 40% less time with their parents than they did 30 years ago. And the void has been filled by technology. And they certainly, can you read it? Yeah. And it starts. I tested this 8-year-old recently, who really cute kid, high functioning autism, very smart boy, and like a lot of kids with autism, he spoke very formally, and it was hot in my office in the summer, and so I turned on a fan, and he felt the breeze, and he said, "I thank you, Dr. Stixrud, for keeping people so cool." I just saw this girl. I reevaluated this girl also with autism, what I saw maybe 3 years ago. And what I saw her 3 years ago, she was 8, and she saw a picture of my daughter in the, I'm in a tuxedo, my daughter's a wedding. And she pointed the picture, she said, "You got married?" I said, "Well, yeah, I did almost 40 years ago." I said, "That's me and my daughter." She said, "You married your daughter?" So this is, there's a couple of people who write a lot about technology in kids' brains. Well, one is Ian Jukes, who's a local guy, Jukes. Well, one is a guy in California named Larry Rosen. And what they both argue is that what Jukes tends to say is that kids' brains are completely different now. And because of the engagement in digital technology and just a different species now that these kids who are growing up. And Rosen talks about, who's probably my age, talks about just if you can't fix something, if something's going wrong with his phone, he gives it to his 3-year-old grandchild who can figure it out. They seem to be so intuitive about it. And so they make this point that kids are really, they're just different in the sense that they crave digital media 24/7, that they want to multitask, they're bored immediately, they can't do more than one thing at a time, and that we know that they want things really fast, that quick boredom. We know that and Howard Gardner, some of you know the name Howard Gardner from the Multiple Intelligences guy. He has a recent book on technology, and they did some studies at Harvard over the last few years. But he said that contemporary kids tend to see the world as an ensemble of apps. They tend to, there's kind of quick solutions for things, and they tend to resist questions that are more complicated, that there's no obvious answer to. And that the contemporary kids tend to be more anxious and risk averse and experience more social isolation. And so, but that he also found signs for increased certain kinds of creativity. It's not all negative, but the idea is that a lot of people are arguing that the brains of kids now are very different. And again, I'm saying that in some ways, that's superficially true. And for example, that for people who, any of us who do a lot of online searching, researching, we tend to, before digital technology, we read in a Z curve where you read this way. And now, we tend to read, or kids tend to read, in an F curve where you tend to scan. And you might move your eyes a little bit over to the right, a little bit right here, but you tend to go down and you go through things much less carefully and much less thoroughly than people did before we started using digital media. And when people talk about what's happening in kids' brains, largely what they talk about is the effects on the visual system. The brain is very visually oriented. And things like this are visual scanning patterns and that seem to change. I'm going to talk about some of the other things like attention and this and that. But a lot of the stuff that has been written focuses on the way kids are becoming so much more visually literate and not so much with print literacy. And when we talk about this visual advantage of the brain, like 30% of the neurons in the brain are focused on vision and 3% on hearing. And so now, I thank God that you don't have to be visually strong to make a living in this world, because 5 years ago, we got a call from this woman who says, we're the company that paints your house number on the curb. And we did it 5 years ago, and usually the rain washes off, it's time to do it again. I said, okay, how much is it? At $90. Okay, so I signed up. So I go out and get the newspaper the next morning. And that dates me as well. I go to the next newspaper, and I realize I don't have a curb. I only lived there for 18.5 years. It wasn't surprising. I took a test when I was 34 on visual memory. I got the same score as the average 7-year-old. So luckily, the brain, you don't have to have a strong visual preference to enable living. Now, let's say a couple of things about. I'm going to talk about TV and video games for a few minutes. Now, there's a study that was done in Canada some years ago, where there's a province in Canada where they hadn't introduced TV. It's like the last one to get TV, and so they introduced TV. And this is sometimes in the 1950s or maybe early 60s, and what they found, and this was just all they had was the news and cartoons and a few things, and what they found, just having TV resulted in more violence and more aggression. And Michael Rich, who is a pediatrician and a former Hollywood guy at Harvard, at Children's Hospital in Boston, who's become kind of a media expert now, kids in media. He said, would you really think about TV as like just having it on, it's like secondhand smoke. And you think about it, you go to a waiting room, you go to an airport, and just have that TV on. You think about how it just raises everybody's stress level, having that noise and that constant stimulation. And there's an office right next to mine that has a TV that has CNN and just it's the idea of having that on all day. It can't not make you more stressful. Now, I'm not saying I love. There's things I love to watch on TV. I'm not against TV. It's just that. So part of my argument is this: that if we really look at what we're learning about how technology affects our development, that the idea that we want kids to be spending more and more time. Right? I'm constantly talking to people who say, "Oh God, I got a great app for that. There's a great technical solution to this problem." And I say, are we really saying you want kids to spend even more time? Why? But I think that so part of the argument here is just having the TV on seems to be increased stress, anxiety, aggression. Now, with video games, I started because of my age. I didn't play video games growing up. My kids didn't really either. And the first lecture I gave about video games, which is probably 10 years ago, all I could find was negative stuff about it. I mean, one of the first studies was a Japanese study where they found very little kids were playing some kind of Nintendo game versus doing serial arithmetic versus they're comparing it to 3 times 8, now subtract 6, now add 15, now subtract, just doing that. And much more frontal lobe activation doing the mental arithmetic, and very little playing the Nintendo game. And this crisis, oh my God, the kids they won't be activating their frontal lobes with all these impulsive kids. And maybe 7 or 8 years ago, the Economist magazine had a cover story with a little kid with like devil horns and saying, you know, our video games turning kids into devils. That's kind of the idea. And it turns out that, I mean, people have always resisted new things. That people thought that Socrates thought that print was going to be the downfall of humanity because you couldn't, it would affect your memory and you couldn't challenge people and have a direct argument. And people thought when the waltz came out that society was falling apart. People rock and roll, going to the hell in a handbasket. And people have always resisted. And I had to kind of fight that myself. I wasn't when I grew up. And it turns out that video games have all kinds of positive benefits. I mean, the training and educational potential for video games is very powerful. I mean, there's a study that was done several years ago at Harvard in residents in laparoscopic surgery. What they found was that the residents who made the most mistakes, who made the most surgical errors, spent less time playing video games than the more accomplished surgeons. And so they prescribed video games to improve their surgical skills. And this guy, Daphne Langley, has an interesting YouTube talk on her research. And it just makes the point that when the brain's engaged in things, it changes the way the brain works. So that you read that these video games, a lot of them, you just talk about the first person shooter games, that there's a lot of cognitive benefit in the sense that the kids are really focused for a long period of time. They're scanning, there's a lot of complex visual scanning. And so things that require very careful attention, being able to pick out detail, it's clutter. You get better at that. When you have to shift your attention rapidly, it makes it possible to do that better. There's things like something this street test. So the idea is this is part 3. The first part is you simply read. You have little blocks of color and you just name them. You go blue, green, yellow, blue, green, like that. And how fast you can name those blocks. The second part is you have the color names in black ink and you just read red, green, blue, yellow, like that. The third part, what you have to do is you have to name the color of the ink. Well, let's do this together. So we'll read the first 2 full rows together. Just name the color of the ink. So this is red. Let's start. Take your mark. Get set. Go. Wait. The first full one. Red is our first answer. Red is our first answer. Ready? Take your mark. Get set. Go. Red, blue, red, green, red, blue, green, blue, red, green.
I'm not awake.
But that's not easy, is it? Now, just completely parenthetically. Kids who have dyslexia, who don't read easily, this isn't hard for them. It's hard for us because we have to inhibit the tendency to read the words. But it turns out that most people can read name the color blocks very quickly. They read the words very quickly. They really slow down to do this. Now, play video games. Play first person shooter video games. You get better at this. You get better at certain kinds of things, and the brain systems that are involved in certain kinds of visual attention and shifting of attention seem to get better. And I think, again, because if you use your brain, it changes the way that it develops. So certainly, I was meditating in a hotel lobby a couple of summers ago, and I heard this kid come in and talk to the manager and said, "Where's the convention center? Because my brother's here from India." And he's playing a match in a video game competition, and he can win $250,000 today. And I want to root him on. And it's a completely different world. I tested a kid maybe 6 months ago. I consulted with this kid who is a young adult. I think he just finished college, and all I can think about is I can't remember which game it is. It's one of the complicated multiplayer games, and he said he's in the top 1% of players in the world in this game. He said, I'm not good enough to play professional. But he can't concentrate on anything else, and so he's looking into, can he do that these competitions attract far more viewers than the Super Bowl. So he's looking, can he do the color commentary in these competitions? When kids used to, 10 years ago, which is like, well, you never make a living at that. Well, people do now. It's a very it's a huge industry. And so I'm saying that there's a lot of benefits to it turns out to playing video games. The concerns tend to be one about violence, and certainly the more violent game. So playing violent video games doesn't turn a nice kid into a murderer, but it does make everybody, almost everybody, more reactive, more likely to get pissed at somebody for something for a minor thing. It does seem to have that effect. So, any thoughts or questions about video games before I go on? Yeah.
What about the increasing application in school and for homework of video games for learning? And that seems to be a trend, despite some of your proof. How do you combat that?
Well, I think what I'd like to do, I'll talk a little bit about schooling at the end. I'd like to hold that question because, I mean, I'll say it this way. It turns out that screen time, and whether it's you look at your phone or computer, TV, is an independent risk factor for a wide range of medical conditions, regardless of how much you exercise. And Larry Rosen, who's one of the guys, this guy in California who's written several books about technology and kids, said that in the 4 dimensions that they've studied, that they said that there's a very strong correlation between technology use and mental health problems, attention problems, physical health problems, and behavioral problems in kids. And I heard Larry lecture a couple years ago, and I asked him, is this just a correlation? Is it the least healthy kids, the heavy set kids, or the uncoordinated kids? They're more sedentary. They play more video games. He says we've controlled for so many variables like that we think it's causative. And so again, this is the bottom line for me, which is that technology is incredible. The potential to solve certain problems is incredible. There's amazing power in entertainment and training, and yet we have this challenging fact that the more we use it, the more stressed, the less happy we get, the sicker we get. And that's why I think that as we move to the point you made, that where kids increasingly they do school, they're wired during the day, and they have to be wired when they go home at night. I think this is something that as a culture we have to deal with, and I will tell you this, that at least as a year ago, there wasn't a single study that's demonstrated that kids learn better through the use of technology than they do through more traditional teaching methods. Now, I mean, I think that I probably most of the kids I see, because I see so many kids who have dyslexia, reading problems, or ADHD, and if you have either one, you tend to have a lot of trouble memorizing math facts. And I see a lot of kids who do have some of these handheld programs that work pretty well for memorizing math facts. I heard this story. I'm not sure if it's true. about a boy in end of first grade, and he's practicing his addition, is going 2 + 3, and that son of a bitch is 5. And 1 + 4, that son of a bitch is 6. And his mother hears and says, "What are you doing? This is the way my teacher taught me." And the mother says, "Mad, so hard." He confronts the teacher the next day, and the teacher says, he said, "What?" I said, "No, I said 2 + 3, the sum of which is 5." This is the true story. One of my tutors told me about, was tutoring this girl some years ago who was in 2nd grade, and her teacher said, "What's the biggest number in the world?" And this little girl kind of tentatively raised her hand and said, 23,000. And the teacher said, "Well, what about 23,001?" And the kid said, "I was so close."
Could I ask you, since you mentioned earlier that you had some experience with high functioning autistic children,
Yeah.
is there any study that shows that technology for these children is more negative than for your average child, or is it more beneficial than for your average child?
So could you do the question? So the question, I mentioned kids with high functioning autism. Do we know is technology more beneficial or harmful for kids?
As compared to for an average child.
So the thing, as in all this stuff, it's mixed in the sense that kids who don't connect well socially. I mean, I know a lot of kids who don't connect well socially, who have a million friends online. I thank God for social media for kids who don't connect well socially. On the other hand, we know that kids who if they have difficulty with self-regulation, if they have some rigidity, they're more likely to become addicted or completely preoccupied with technology. And many kids in the spectrum, that's all they think about. They can't get them to do anything else. And so I think they're mixed bag. I mean, I think that they have that certainly, but much of the technology that we have is created by people with high functioning autism or something very, very similar to it. Sometimes yeah.
What about the gender gap? Anecdotally, I see even in my family, the boys spend quintuple the amount of time as the girls on these interactive games. And as girls are at a higher rate attending college now, is there any correlation of the past generation of kids that the girls aren't interacting with media, or is that just my aunt? Or are they using it?
No, it's really. I think the girls spend a lot more time on social media than boys more time game playing. And again, and certainly could there be some connection between kids spending more time playing, boys spending more time playing video games, and their decreased academic competence. I mean, I think there's a lot of factors that explain why boys are having more trouble now, including the fact that we're asking that boys develop more slowly than girls. And when we decided some years ago, some genius decided that let's start teaching kids in kindergarten what we used to teach them in 1st grade. I think that's really hammered boys a lot, because they're slower than girls are to develop, and almost all the brain structures, all the functions that allow you to do school. So let me say a couple other things there. I'll say a couple things about. I mentioned the concern about video game violence, about addiction. It turns out it's maybe slightly less than 10% of kids who play video games seem to have an addictive relationship to them, and just can't think about other things, lie about how much they use, will wait for the night to play them. And with social media, it's the same thing in the sense that there's so many advantages to it. The kids, the way we live now, where kids don't have many kids to play with in their neighborhoods, so they don't have as much face-to-face time. They can stay connected socially. That there's research that suggests that shy kids will interact much more in social media. And when schools use social media for projects and this and that, the kids who won't speak up in class will be much more forthcoming and much more likely to participate through social media than they will face-to-face in the classroom. Kids with social anxiety, this seems to be helped by this kind of communication. And so there's all kinds of positive benefits that people are talking about. The studies have found that kids really do share ideas, share projects, and schools can use it in very, very positive ways. And the concerns are about bullying and the kind of culture of sarcasm and cruelty that tends to exist in social media. There's concern about certainly how much time kids spend, how preoccupying it is. MTV did a study of young people from, I think it was 16 to 30. And what the young people said is that they're completely preoccupied. They feel exhausted by trying to keep up their social media presence, but they're completely unable to walk away from it. My son some years ago introduced me to the acronym FOMO. You know FOMO, the fear of missing out. Some years ago, he said that's what it's all is. That fear you're going to miss out on something, and so there's that, and certainly the sexting, the overload, the incredible distraction. There's a question on the new IQ test for kids. I'll tell you, Steve, coach your kids, which is, I won't give you the answer, which is, why do some teachers not want kids to use their cell phones in class? No, I don't know why it says some teacher, but in any case, it's the distraction. People are talking about now a Facebook depression, the kids who's been too absorbed and too moved by social media tend to be vulnerable to depression. I mean, the idea that everybody else has such a great life and mine sucks, that kind of thing. Shelley Turkle at MIT just has a new book and has written a couple of really interesting books on the development of identity in kids. Is concerned about the social media, the posturing, and the having to present yourself. Kids growing up in a culture where everything they can do, somebody can capture on it. Every stupid thing they do could be photographed and sent out to other people to shame them. That kids are much more connected with each other, but they're less connected with themselves. Leonard Sachs, the pediatrician who writes a lot about gender issues, has I think, a very good book on girls. And the concern, again, about social media is about the girls' development of a sense of self and not being overly preoccupied with how they're presenting, everything being judged, whether they like or not like, whatever they do. So these kind of concerns, I think, are very realistic. Now, what about doing all this stuff at the same time? So, there's been several studies that have asked college students to rate themselves in terms of how good they are at multitasking. And every single time, it turns out that the kids who think that they're really the best multitaskers are actually the most inefficient. And it turns out that you really can't multitask. It turns out that you can listen to music or have a conversation while you're driving, as long as you don't have to pay attention to your driving. But the bottom line is, you can't pay attention to two things at the same time. You can only pay attention to one thing at a time. So what multitasking is very rapidly shifting, or not so rapidly, it's shifting your attention. And so I read recently that some overwhelming percentage of kids now, when they're reading a novel for school, have two other kinds of media going on while they're reading. And it turns out what they're doing, they aren't really multitasking. They're shifting their attention. And what we know from every single study that's ever been done is that when you do that, it takes you much longer, oftentimes twice as long, to accomplish a task, and you make a lot more errors. We also know that multitasking is stressful. It raises your stress hormone levels. And the dilemma, as I see it, is that, I don't know if I slide it like this, I'll come back. But the dilemma is this. People like Larry Rosen, who I have a lot of respect for, he seems like a pretty good guy, pretty good judgment. But he said his angle is basically kids can't stand to do one thing at a time anymore. They're bored. We have to kind of basically, we have to let them multitask as well. I know it's inefficient and it may take them longer, but most things don't have really incredible deadlines, and it's a big deal. And the dilemma for me is that where we want to go? I mean, is that where we want to go, where we know that it's stressful, it's inefficient, that mindfulness is certainly one of the most popular things in our culture now because it's the antidote to this kind of mind scattering multitasking. That be in the present, be focused on what you're doing right now, as opposed to trying to do three things at once. And so, and dilemma for me, again, is that kids love it. Kids, they think they can do it well. It's delusional, but they think they can do it well, and they don't realize that it's stressful. And we just we got to let them do it, because otherwise they'll be bored all the time, or they'll fight what we want them to do. They'll resist efforts to unitask. Yeah.
So does that include music, listening to music, watching, attending to IE homework?
So, no, well, I mean, I wrote something a few years ago, right? I can think of at least 3 good reasons where kids would want to be, say, listen to music while they do homework. One is that for a lot of kids, it serves like white noise. For some kids, homework makes them anxious, and listening to familiar music makes them less anxious. And for a lot of kids, homework is boring, and having the music on makes them less boring. And I will say that probably half the psychologists in my group write reports listening to music, and I wouldn't get anything done. I mean, it's very, the individual differences are very striking. And what I encourage kids to do is, certainly by the time they're teenagers, is to pay attention. I say, you know yourself better than anybody else. Pay attention. If you have the music on, does it help you focus better, or does it distract you? And I think that the idea is you can't consciously listen to music or listen to the lyrics or and do homework. If it's like background, if it's in the background and you aren't attending to it, then for some people it does seem to be helpful. Yeah.
I was just going to say, one study I read said only jazz and classical is supposed to help, not inhibit while you're trying to get other work done. And that even things like the relaxing spa music, the study said that those things and words create that multitasking in your mind that has been proven to not be possible.
I think
personally,
anything with lyrics, I think probably it's more problematic. And I'll see kids, I mean, that listening to really hardcore metal music, and I think it's largely to deal with the boredom and the anxiety, as opposed to actually making it easier to study. Yeah.
Are attention deficit disorder children more successful in multitasking than your average child?
No, I don't think so. No. They might become more easily to them because it's hard to focus on one thing. But
maybe they need it.
I've never seen any evidence. When I say no, I've never seen any evidence that it's possible to studies I don't know about. I've never seen any evidence. So I'm going to very quickly talk about what we know. As I said earlier, screen time, media use is increasingly looking like an independent risk factor in adults for heart disease and type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and in children, kind of this same thing. I mean, that the more you spend an hour playing video games, blood pressure goes up, versus reading, where your blood pressure goes down. And again, this is the challenge. This is the main challenge for me, is that we know that, and this is independent of how much you exercise. So it's not just being sedentary. There's something about the use of technology, and maybe this kind of secondhand smoke. The thing I was talking about was the TV. And for me, I take this pretty seriously. If in fact, we should take this seriously. And so the adults, the likelihood of their dying from cardiovascular event is 100% greater if they watch a lot of TV than if they don't. regardless of much of the other slides. And, yeah,
So would you say the same thing about reading on a Kindle? Does that count as screen time?
that's such a great question. And I think that, that it probably does. I mean, I think that almost anything on a screen seems to be not so good. Yeah. So, but I haven't, there's studies comparing print reading and Kindle reading, and there seem to be advantages for both. But in terms of this health piece, I don't know. I don't know the answer. It's a very good question.
But you know, a lot of the school books the kids have to use now are all online.
I know. And that's why I'm just saying that this technology, that any single thing, I mean, there's a lot of cool things and a lot of potential. It's just that, if what I'm telling you is true, and but Larry Rosen, who's a big proponent of using technology in schools, and is saying we got to let them multitask. That I'm going to show you a quote of Larry Rosen about schools, about that we're going to lose this whole generation if we don't completely wire schools. And he says all their studies that the more technology you use, the more attention problems, behavior problems, physical health problems, mental health problems. So, so I'll share where I'm going with this in just a minute. So, part of this is now that 87% of kids who have cell phones sleep with them turned on, so they can touch during the night. And the level of sleep deprivation now is just unparalleled.
Where's that from?
Pardon?
87%, where's that from?
I don't remember. If you Google 87% cell phone sleep, you'll get it. Just in terms of technology and anxiety, I went to the Farmers Museum in upstate New York with my kids. We went to see the baseball hall.
Sorry, there's an ambulance behind you.
Fire.
There's a what?
Sorry.
It's fine. We have a fire truck visiting our,
Oh.
Of course they turn the lights on.
It's not just technology that makes it feel upgraded.
Where was so I went to the Farmers Museum, Upper State New York. We went to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and what did you do the next day? Well, the Farmers Museum. And all the exhibits, the caption was, it was widely anticipated that this new invention, like various kinds of things that were invented on farms, like plows and this and that, and the steam iron. All of them, the caption said that it was widely anticipated that this would decrease work, but it actually led to more work. And the example I remember is the steam iron, where it said that before the ironing became so easy, the people had to heat their irons on coal, and the people would do it once a month. When they made it easier, they started ironing once a week. And I think that you think about how busy we are. And the idea that technology creates more leisure, it just hasn't turned out that way. And in many ways, it seems to create more work, because anything that's easier, we just do more of it. And it'd be hard to argue that increasing the pace of life. When I was in first time I went to graduate school, I was in literature, and I flunked out, thank God. But I read this book that was written in 1863 about the increased nervousness in America. And it was so interesting. In 1863, I'm sorry, 1883. And it was written by a physician who was hypothesizing, why do people seem to be so much more anxious now than they did 20 years ago? And it was stuff like the telegraph, things that made life go faster. The pocket watch. Now instead of just, I'll meet you sometime Thursday afternoon, that I'm going to be late. and that technology makes life go faster, and makes it stressful. This is the point I've been making about the need to use. And there's also concern about narcissism. In terms of schooling, again, there's a lot of people who are arguing that we're going to lose kids, especially boys, if we don't use a lot of video games and things in schools. Video games are competing against a boring teacher kind of idea. And yet, this idea that the more they use, the more problems they have. How do we finesse this? This is Larry Rose making a case for adapting. We no longer ask our children to live in a world where they're immersed in technology in all parts of their lives except when they go to school. We must rewire education, risk losing this generation of media. And there's a lot of people who don't agree with this. There's a lot of people, there's Greenfield at UCLA, there's Greenfield in England, who make a lot of compelling arguments about how it really undermines learning that you think that hyperlink, you could actually you can click on anything you want to know in a paragraph or a passage, that it turns out the kids learn more without hyperlink. It turns more that if you watch CNN and without the crawl, you actually remember more. That there's things that seem intuitive about technology's field, but it doesn't pan out. And so there's people who are the guy who's the spokesman for Finnish education in Finland, where the best educational outcomes in the world. We think very differently than we do in many ways. He says that schools can't afford to keep up with the newest technology that all the kids have in their pockets. And a lot of people in Finland, the parents are saying, let's make schools a technology-free oasis because the kids are just inundated with it. So it's a controversial thing. There's a lot of people. Marianne Wolf, who is one of the world's experts on reading, says that kids really should delay use of technology until they develop a reading brain, because kids read more superficially, as I was saying, and now with the multitasking, they don't really have that experience as much of really being moved by what they read and being able to kind of wrestle with what they read. And so the kind of stuff that I recommend, certainly there's a lot of concern about attention. I think it's a culture. There's no evidence necessarily that playing more video games gives you ADHD, but it is as a culture. We certainly, I had a Lincoln Douglas debates because people stood in the field for 6 and 7 hours listening to these guys debate. How many of us could do that now? And so, Art Sigmund is the guy who is one of the guys who's written about the effects of screen time on health. His recommendations for parents or for kids are basically delay or minimize screens altogether until age 3, keep them out of the bedroom. With younger kids, games and programs at slower pace, less novelty, monitor, control kids' time on media, and model responsible usage. And this modeling piece is really important. One of my colleagues moved to Florida years and years ago, sent me a postcard and said, I want to give you some advice that my mother gave me, because I sure as heck won't be using it. And kids learn a lot by what we model. Michael Rich is this guy at the Children's Hospital in Boston. His suggestions are to model responsible use, same thing. Take computers and platforms in common areas, play games with kids. And I'm struck as somebody who, that when my kids were interested in something, I try to figure out, I got, whether it's sports or drama, I try to get into it. And I see so many parents who know nothing about the games they kids play. And it turns out that it's much easier to help your kids regulate their use of technology if you do stuff with video games. If you play, if somebody in the family plays with them, the parent will play, and then it becomes much. But when people used to ask me, how should I set limits on my kids' video game use? I used to say an hour a day, and then the kids would say, well, it takes an hour and a half to get to the next level. So it's completely frustrating. Then I started to say, negotiate with the kid. I mean, really, let's collaborative figure this out. How to make this work. And I think it's much easier to do if we have some understanding of what they're doing and show interest in the games. Yeah.
After we're running out of time.
Yeah.
We have 3 kids. We've been running an experiment at our home based on an idea that my wife and I had, that the kids don't really remember how much time they're spending using their technology. So every Sunday night at dinner, we ask them the same question. Name 3 things you did in the last week, okay? And they struggle with that a little bit, but then they remember. We've been writing it down now, so we have several pages of notes. Not one answer has any reference to use of technology. Not one single answer, okay? What's going on?
Well, I mean, because you know your kids, what do you make out of it?
Well, they spend a lot of time. We limit it and all of that, but there's a lot of time, both for school and for play and gaming. Many, many hours are consumed. But when we ask them, what did you do? Name 3 things you did that using the technology has never once come up, right? I went to a birthday party, I had a sleepover, I played tennis. Those are the answers. So if we're using this in school, I'm wondering, are we missing is there a big disconnect here?
Certainly, one of the best things, certainly one of the bottom line is that it's not like we're going to dig a big hole and pull our tablets and our computers and their cell phones in. But getting away from it is really important. And for many kids, going to camp in the summer, it's the most satisfying, enjoyable, freeing experience that they have. They're completely technology free. And I think that it's crucial that kids have daily periods of being unplugged. And it's a substantial time being unplugged. And ideally, even times where they're just bored and have nothing to do, where they get to activate this default mode network. Yes?
Kind of a question and comment about keeping the computers in common places.
Yeah.
I've been struggling with this with my 3 children, and ages 12, 18, 20, which is they need a quiet place to do their homework, but they need their computers to do their homework. So like when I put the computers in a common area to kind of monitor it, then they're surrounded by all the noise and activity of the home and they can't focus on their homework. But if they're in a quiet place in their room or in a separate area with the computer to do their homework, then I can't monitor what they're doing on the computer. It just seems like we keep beating our heads in the wall to try and address this issue.
Right. And I think that this is changing so fast, and the amount of stuff that kids need to do on a computer for school now is changing so fast that somebody might have said this 5 years ago. And so, certainly, trying as much as we can to keep technology out of the bedroom is a really good idea. And I think even as parents, I think that we can model, if we can charge our phones, and we can charge our computers in the kitchen, so we aren't bringing technology to the bedroom ourselves. And it helps us, particularly for teenagers, who see us less as hypocrites, if we do it that way. And certainly by the time that they're older, I don't want to send a kid to college who doesn't have a fair amount of experience regulating their own technology use. So it's not like we want to be with older teenagers. We don't want to necessarily be monitoring them constantly. We want to say to them, you got to figure this out before you go to college. That's how regular use. Yes.
My question actually leads from what you were just finishing off with in terms of self-regulation is how do we teach that? If I have a child who naturally just wants to turn on the TV and sit there and I have to actively engage her up, and clearly children are different because my other child happily walks away after 15 minutes. Is that something that we sort of open the floodgates and give them some trust and time to figure out, or is that something we lay the groundwork and assume they're going to sort of take on after a while? I mean,
I think it depends on how old they are. I think with younger kids, I think we just set limits on it, and we make using technology contingent on not freaking out when it's time to turn it off. But also, from early on, we engage in this collaborative problem solving with them, where I know that how much you love to do this, and it makes me happy to see them how much you enjoy this stuff. At the same time, because I know that if you use it too much, it's not good for you, and I don't want to feel like I'm doing a bad job as a mother. How can we work this out? And I think that respectfully and empathically acknowledging this is powerful, this is fun for you. I get that, but also I can't, in good conscience, let you do this. So how should we work it out? And work out some kind of schedule that's comfortable. Let's try this for a week and see how we can talk about it again. But I think that's where we want to go. I mean, ultimately, whether the kid spends 45 minutes or 2 hours, it may not be that big a deal, but I think engaging this kind of collaborative, let's figure this out together. You know more about the technology than I do. But I want to feel like I'm a good mother, and I can't if I just feel like I'm letting you do this stuff and not do anything else. And yes.
What are your general recommendations on how much screen time a child should have on various ages? And if you do allow screen time, is it, I mean, from what I'm understanding, let's say you do like a reading game on the computer, that's the same detriment as just watching TV.
Well,
not?
Yeah, well, I think again, that just having the TV on, just having the computer on, you just probably makes things more stressful. And so I think, I don't know if there's any hard and fast rules because kids' schedules are so different. I mean, there are kids who play sports and just naturally spend very little time with electronic entertainment. Other kids who are athletic and they want to spend more time and I'm okay. I mean, I thank God for those entertainments for a lot of kids. But I think that what we want to do is we want to make sure that they have substantial periods during the day and longer periods during the summer or the weekend where they're not plugged in. Because if we don't learn, if the kids don't learn how to live with themselves when they're not plugged in, I think it's worrisome. And it's hard. There was a study recently, several studies that were written up together, where young adult college students were given they were asked to sit just quietly with their own thoughts, ranging from 6 to 15 minutes. And the men, and the idea was that if you get bored, you can give yourself a little electric shock. And virtually everybody said, no, I never do that. 64% of the men, 64% of the men chose to self-administer electric shock rather than sit quietly. No, only 50% of the women. Yeah. So I think that the idea of not being able to kind of live with yourself is challenging. So I don't know if there's hard and fast limits on it. I mean, I think with young kids, preschool age kids, we should be very limited.
Like 30 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour?
Yeah, if I had a 4-year-old, I don't know why 4 or 5-year-olds we need to use technology at all. I mean,
for our sanity.
What's that?
For our sanity.
Well,
I mean, you said that you would come home and talk to your wife and your kid would watch, I mean, at least they're watching PBS.
Oh, yeah. So in terms of video games, that kind of stuff. So if they're doing it, and their friends are doing that, you don't want your kid to be the only one who's not doing this stuff. And so I would say, for little kids, it's certainly an hour a day for elementary school age kids. And if they don't have anything to do, some kids, if they do 2 hours a day, it's not going to turn.
So this hour a day, though, is in excess of what they've been doing at school, though.
Right.
So do we monitor? I mean, like when I tell my kids no screen time during the week, I don't know what they've been doing between 8 a.m. and 3 p.m. So
right. And I think as long as you can go with it. I mean, there are kids who will fight you so much that it's just not worth it. But if your kids kind of buy that, they'll get it. I think it's great. Again, I think that there's the main thing though is that we have periods where they aren't plugged in. They aren't in front of the screen. And whether they're reading, or whether they're playing, or whether they're playing video games, I mean, they're doing sports, or they're doing music, or stuff like that. And families negotiate this kind of no screen time during the week. But there's some kids that accept it fine, and I think it works well. I think that again, as they get older, we want them to have the experience of the temptation of playing video games all day, or be on the internet all night, because we don't want to send them off to college until they've really wrestled with how do I regulate this. You don't want to send them into the most dysregulated living environment outside of a war zone until they've had some practical. Yes.
Is there a source that you would recommend for a guideline on how to let go between the ages of 12 and 17 to give them the chance for self-regulation? Because if you let off the reins now, I mean, since the daily.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't, there's a book called The Great Disconnect by Catherine Adair Steiner, I think her name is. Steiner Adair, that has some nice suggestions for families. And I don't know whether she addresses this exact point, but does she? Yeah. See, what I see is I see kids going off to college whose technology use has been regulated by their parents and all through high school. And they go to college and it's like video games. They haven't had to deal with it themselves. And I think that we want, with adolescents, we want to be saying to teenagers that I think the best message we can give an adolescent is that I have confidence in your ability to make decisions about your own life and learn from your mistakes. And I want you to have enough experience. I mean, it's hard enough for the rest of us I remember the first time I started playing solitaire. One more game, and I think letting kids know that we're all in this together. We're trying to figure out this too. That many of us feel technology overloaded. We love it, or that it's got a love-hate kind of thing, and we're all in this together. Let's figure this out together. And I want you to have practice before you go off to school. But the idea, if kids can go to summer camps that are unplugged, it is such a healing thing. My own son, when he was right after college, he did an outdoor leadership program for 3 months. He came back and said, I hated my phone. Yeah, the idea that the constant, and I think that remembering that we're part of nature. And if we don't act like we're part of, I mean, we've already, we sleep, what, probably 2 or 3 hours less than we did 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. And we're used to be more in tune with the light and dark cycles of nature. If we don't remember we're part of nature, I think we're it doesn't bode well. So that certainly time to nature, physical exercise, non-technological play, putting as high premium as you can on sleep. There's arguably nothing better, more important than developing brain than sleep. Yes?
Could I ask, looking into the future and our future brains, I had read in the past somewhere that people that are going to suffer of Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's. With Alzheimer's, if let's say they are caffeine drinkers, that the onset will be later in life than what it would have been. Is there any connection with the use of technology and developing Alzheimer's sooner or later, or any benefit to it? Or?
So the question is there a connection between use of technology and the later development of Alzheimer's, either positive or negative? And I don't know any. The correlational studies, they're hard to interpret because there's a study a few years ago that found that kids who watched a lot of TV before age 3 were much more likely to have ADHD when they were 7. And the implication was the TV caused well, most people know ADHD. So wait a minute, that if you're a mom, you got an ADHD kid, aren't you putting in front of the TV that it was a kid who already had ADHD, and that's why so much time watching TV. So it's hard, these correlational studies, it's hard to tell. There's a study recently where people that sleeping as an older adult, that if you slept more than 6 or 7 hours a night, you had more health problems. And so, but the implication being, don't sleep so much. Well, there's not a single study that suggests that getting less sleep is good for you. But what it is that as you get to be my age, you don't sleep 9 hours anymore unless you're on medication for other things, you know. So, yeah. So, but I could be this nonverbal cue here. Thank you for having me.
And thank you, sir. I mean, I'm sure everyone has a ton more questions, a very interesting topic, and a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much. As we had mentioned, the handout, and I'm sure